I am Michael Vlahos. I am here today in the library of the illustrious Army-Navy Club in Washington, D.C., the Imperial City, with Colonel Douglas McGregor, United States Army retired, to talk about the war in Ukraine. A word about me. I have taught war and strategy variously since 1980 at the NHTSA School SAIS and the Johns Hopkins University here in DC, and for some years at the Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, and at the Centro de Estudios Superiores Navales, the Mexican War College in El Ciudad de Mexico. I've also served in the CIA as a senior executive in the State Department and with the Navy. Colonel McGregor is one of the most renowned American soldiers of the latter part of the 20th century. He is currently the last officer to lead an armored cavalry squadron in tank-to-tank combat at the Battle of 73 Easting during Desert Storm. Colonel McGregor is a national champion of military reform and perhaps the most important thinker on American combat power and grand strategy currently writing today. His most recent book, Margin of Victory, will frame much of our conversation. The war in Ukraine is still raging after 9 months and 10 days. First and foremost, we should remember that the war is the creation and indeed the culmination of a long-standing and aggressive U.S. policy of NATO expansion into former Soviet states, especially Ukraine. The backstory of this war is there for everyone to see, laid bare by lectures and interviews of John Mearsheimer, the writing of Jim Goldgeier on promises we made to Boris Yeltsin, and archives released detailing U.S. government representations to Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet premier. So therefore, today, in contrast, we want to talk about the more recent past, present, and future of this war. Accordingly, this will be a conversation like a concerto or a sonata of 3 parts or movements. First, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Second, why has NATO failed so strongly at the strategic level? And look at a proxy war effectively run on denial and deceit. And third, finally, what is to be done and where do we go from here? So, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Colonel McGregor, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And let's start off at the beginning. What was the original conception of the special military operation in terms of its goals and the net assessment that allowed Putin to initiate it?
Yeah, I think President Putin decided that all of his efforts to talk us into some level of understanding had failed. And having failed to persuade us that Russia would not tolerate NATO membership for Ukraine and would not tolerate the eventual positioning of NATO forces, especially NATO missiles, long-range strike weapons in eastern Ukraine, led him to conclude he had to go in and demonstrate just how serious he was. I think he made a number of assumptions about how this would work out that turned out to be invalid. One of his assumptions was that the United States, in particular, the leadership in Washington, as well as the leadership in Kiev, would want to negotiate, that they would want to avoid a wider war. I don't think he was prepared for what turned out to be the opposite. So the first going in proposition was, we're going in with limited numbers of troops. We're going a short distance into eastern Ukraine, principally into those areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. And we plan to demonstrate that we are serious and we want to negotiate. And he outlines certain things that he wanted. Number one, obviously, Ukraine had to be neutral, not a member of NATO. Neutrality. Right. Didn't go into great detail about what that neutrality would mean, but probably something close to Austria or Finland. Secondly, he thought, well, there are two provinces that are, or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, that are breakaway, Donetsk and Luhansk, and they should have the right to live as Russians inside Ukraine, have equal rights as Russians, as Ukrainian citizens, enjoy some measure of autonomy. And then, of course, there's the issue of Crimea. Please recognize the legitimacy of Russian control of Crimea, which, from the standpoint of the Russians, having conquered it in the 1770s, is a self-evident truth. Now, in addition to that, he also talked about eventually having a Russian representative sit on the equivalent of the Ukrainian National Security Council,
right,
simply as a representative of Russian interests to that Security Council. That's about it.
So he would have been not happy, but satisfied with that as an outcome.
Yes. And I think he was quite surprised that there was no real willingness to seriously consider it. Now, we do have evidence towards the end of March, after the war had been going on for 6 weeks,
right,
that Mr. Zelensky said, well, we could live with neutrality. And when that word seems to have reached Washington and London,
Boris Johnson,
people became incensed, and Boris Johnson represented Washington's interests and said, absolutely not. We will support you to the bitter end. You must stand your ground and fight for every inch of Ukraine.
Oh, apropos of this, why did Mr. Putin believe that this would work? The U.S. had been training up essentially a ersatz NATO force, the second strongest army in Europe after Russia, up to NATO standards, and had spent billions on this enterprise. Now, why would Putin not take that into account?
I think there are several reasons. First of all, Vladimir Putin, unlike his predecessors, really does know something about the West.
Right.
If we go back through many Soviet and Russian leaders over centuries, very few had actually traveled outside of their homeland. That's not the case with Vladimir Putin. And he is predisposed to cooperate with the West, not just on a business level, but also in a cultural sense.
His record shows that.
Yeah, so that was part of it. Secondly, he did not want to convey the impression that there was anything Soviet-like about the current state. And so he was not going to send forces into Ukraine that would be destructive.
You mean like Hungary in 56?
Of course. And he gave strict orders to the forces that went in there. I don't want you to kill civilians. I want you to minimize losses in the civilian population. Try not to destroy infrastructure. And I think his assumption was that we would somehow or another figure out what his intentions were. We were never really interested in his intentions. In fact, from our vantage point, I think we thought this war was manna from heaven. That this was a war that this new Ukrainian army that we'd invested so heavily in could win. And we mistook, the underlying assumptions that shaped the initial operation as evidence for weakness.
So the initial operation that was supposed to be completed within a few weeks turned out to be, in effect, the initial phase of a longer war. And at what point did the Russians and Mr. Putin realize that the Ukrainians, being persuaded to fight what amounts to, from their perspective, total war, did Russia decide to recalibrate?
That's a question that's tough to answer without seeing the actual transcripts of the meetings that were conducted. But we know that in April and May, there were several meetings and several discussions, because the feedback that was coming from Ukraine, from the Russians living in Ukraine, was very interesting. Because the Russian troops told them, well, we're here to liberate you, but we're not staying. And so the Russian-speaking population said, well, if you're not going to stay, as soon as you leave, if we cooperate with you, the Ukrainian secret police that we call the SBU will come here, shoot all of us in the head.
And this happened.
Yeah, so if you're not going to stay, literally, the hell with you. We're not going to support it. This became increasingly obvious as the war drew on, and that was the first thing. The second thing was we sent very hostile signals. You go back to March and listen to President Biden's speech,
Yeah.
which was the famous regime change speech,
Right.
by accident, that until Putin is removed and this state is transformed into something that meets our standards,
Right.
there can be no peace. And I think it took a while for that to sink in. And suddenly, by the beginning of the summer, it was very clear that what they had done would not secure Russia.
So what you're describing is not something that Americans really understand, is that when the initial phase essentially ran into a brick wall, there was a transitional period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks in which the Russians recalibrated and
Yes.
reassessed their situation. And then
Yes.
from what we've discussed, they went into a strategic defensive mode in which they held the territory they'd taken in the south, consolidated it by taking Mariupol and then the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk conurbation, and manned it with a relatively small force, a kind of economy of force operation.
Yes, they never had more than 20% of their ground force engaged.
Right.
That is a very small contingent, about 190,000 troops initially. And then it became clear that that was going to be inadequate because the war was not going to end with the capture of these territories.
Right.
So there, at some point in the summer, there was a meeting between the General Staff, the Stavka, and I think President Putin. And his question was, well, what do we have to do to win this war and
Right.
end it?
Right.
Because the key issue is not just we want to win on the battlefield, we want to win in such a way as we bring this war to a close.
Right. And although severe casualties had been inflicted on the Ukrainian army, or, the original Ukrainian army, the U.S. and Britain were very active in training and equipping new cadre
Yes.
of Ukrainian into effective forces, and this began to be demonstrated in the end of August and into September and October.
Well, people were always shown these marvelous films of
Right.
Russian tanks being destroyed by various things, javelin missiles, and of course the one weapon system the British are using, this light anti-tank weapon system, which is really very, very good. It's turned out to be much more effective
Than the
based
Javelin, yeah.
than the Javelin, based on the reports coming in. And the Russians looked at all of this and said, well, Mr. President, if you want us to win this and bring this to a close, we have to make fundamental change in all of the assumptions.
Right.
And first and foremost, we have to move over to the strategic defensive. And this is going to have to be, for the time being, an economy of force operation because we don't have enough forces. Not only are you going to have to bring in most of the regular army,
Right.
the active force, we're going to need additional reservists and volunteers. What's really interesting on the Russian side is the enormous success
Yeah.
which they've had with volunteers, not just Chechnya, but also within Russia itself. So this changed the character, but then the decision was, well, if we're going to hold this territory, and this is when Surovikin is named the new commander, he said, I'm happy to hold this territory, but I don't want to be committed to holding every inch of this.
Right.
If I feel it's necessary to withdraw somewhere to economize so that I
Yes.
can be more successful elsewhere, I want to be able to do that. And President Putin said, you are now the theater commander. You are in command. Everyone takes orders from you. So there was a restructuring of the commands to ensure that he was now the final say on any operational item that occurred in the theater. That was not the case earlier.
So the second phase, which was marked initially by an adaptation to the circumstances that the Russians found themselves in, actually evolved during the course of this phase into something more productive than simply holding the line.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is somewhat reminiscent to me of the withdrawal of the German army, which was also outnumbered in World War I, to the so-called Hindenburg Line in 1917, where what the Russians did, the Germans, did is leave a barren wasteland, that was full of obstacles and mines, and pull back to a position that shortened the front and allowed them to build up a larger strategic reserve. And it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that Surovikin sort of deliberately did this in both the part of the Kharkiv Oblast and also
Yes.
in Kherson Oblast.
Yeah, well, the Russians have an advantage, though, over us in this sense. They understand that ground in and of itself has no real value unless it confers a military advantage on you.
Right.
There's no point in just holding onto ground for the sake of saying, well, here on the map I've drawn a line and I'll go no further, which, of course, was the Hitlerian mistake that lost the war in the East, or one of them.
Right.
And the bottom line is, he said, look, we're not going to defend something that we can easily retake when we decide it's necessary. We're going to stay where we think we can defend effectively. And so for weeks I was being asked by people, well, the Russians withdrew 10 kilometers here, they withdrew 20 here, and so aren't they in retreat? Is this not evidence for Russian decay and a crumbling defense? Never. It never was. But all of these things were approved by Surovikin. He made it very clear that local commanders had authority to do what made sense, but he was still in command, and these decisions had to be checked with him.
Well, what's interesting is this development during the second phase actually turned into a bonus that would help prepare the way for the third phase, which was the development of through mobilization, through a unified command, through preparation of the battlefield, a good layout of the land for the fourth phase, which would be the actual offensive.
Well, before we leave this second phase, I think
Yeah.
it's useful to point out that Surovikin is in a position not very different from Montgomery during World War II.
Right.
Americans usually scorn Field Marshal Montgomery based on
True.
this ridiculous Patton movie, which was unfair to Montgomery. Montgomery's actually a very competent officer, but Montgomery was very sensitive to minimizing his casualties. And when Surovikin took over, he made it very clear he would not countenance any frontal assaults. He was not going to waste lives unnecessarily. And I think he got the same level of trust and confidence from Putin
Yes.
that Montgomery got from Churchill. You can do whatever you want. I will give you all the material necessary, and we will do what you say, and we will attack when you're ready. And I think Surovikin is the sort of man that said, I'm not making a move until all of the conditions are met that I think are essential to guarantee successful offensive operations.
Well, could we go through each of the elements of shaping the battlefield? So the third phase quite clearly has been one of mobilization, building up forces, levying attrition on Ukrainian forces to weaken them, perhaps fatally. And then there's also preparation of the battlefield for the offensive. Could you just go through those?
Well, I think if you talk about intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the Russians are not going to make the mistake that they made before they went into eastern Ukraine.
Right.
In other words, they're not going to assume that they're going to enjoy support without commitments that they're prepared to make to the population.
Yeah.
They also understand that infrastructure is important, but not all infrastructure. And they also want to make absolutely certain that they are going to annihilate most of what passes for air defense before they begin this offensive. And that's also, by the way, very reminiscent of the Allies during World War II, that went to great lengths to strip away as much as possible the German Air Force. And then finally, I think the buildup of supplies and ammunition, the pre-positioning of medical support, all of those things have been happening, and Surovikin has been personally involved in it. He and Putin, by the way, have actually gone down to the troop level to look at how these reservists are being equipped. Do they have the right winter clothing? Do they have the right set of equipment? Do they have the adequate training? This has been a very thorough process. And what he wants to know at some point is, first of all, is the transportation infrastructure now at a standstill? Have we attacked all the fuel and ammunition storage points?
Right.
Have we eliminated the power grid for all intents and purposes, forcing people to flee because, frankly, from their vantage point, the fewer civilians they have to deal with, the better.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, to their credit, and they never get credit for this, they always bring food and medicine with them
I know.
when they move into these areas and distribute it.
There's ample demonstration of that.
And no one carries this in the West
Right,
because we're
right.
busy maintaining this narrative of the evil Russians.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are being carefully examined. And when he's satisfied that in each of these categories, I'm sure he probably has a chart somewhere. You know, we sometimes did it in the Pentagon as red, green, or yellow.
Yeah, I know.
He may have something similar to that. Has this condition been met?
Right.
When all of those are met, and of course we're talking about weather, which is no small consideration in that part of the world. And I know that they have been waiting for things to freeze, and they just haven't gotten there yet in the deep south.
No, you had said at one point to me that it would take 2 weeks
Yes.
at the end of the Rasputitsa for the ground to thoroughly freeze. So you said to a level of
Right.
3 or 4 feet.
But now, having said that, we have to go back and re-examine this economy of force mission,
Right.
which has turned into something much more than an economy of force mission.
Yeah.
They discovered that they could actually induce the Ukrainians to launch counterattacks against them.
It's true.
And this is the issue that we don't really appreciate in the ground force. We don't appreciate this coupling of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance,
Right.
with strike weaponry. Not just artillery in the conventional sense, but
Yes.
everything that falls into the standoff attack category. And the Russians have a lot of experience with this. Certainly in World War II, there's this famous event when they had surrounded 50,000 German troops outside of Minsk, which I cover in the book. Zhukov, as an Army front commander, was able to say, I want every aircraft available, immediately scrambled to attack the Germans in this encirclement. Within minutes, thousands of Soviet aircraft, bombers, fighter bombers began arriving and pulverizing the Germans. And by this time in the war, they were surrounded by armor, tanks, and artillery, so the Germans couldn't get out, which historically they'd been able to escape.
Yeah. Like
Well, if you fast forward,
pockets.
if you fast forward in this process, if you fast forward to the present, there are examples of cruise missiles being launched within minutes from the Black Sea, from vessels down there, to strike targets in Ukraine as far north as Kharkov, where there were Ukrainian artillery and anti-tank positions that could not be reached by any other means. And it was done within minutes. There was no lengthy debate with the Air Force. There was no lengthy targeting discussion. It was done.
So
simply.
the productive attrition, both of logistical capability, but also of the forces themselves, is really taking advantage of a period during Rasputitsa where the Russians have to wait. They're preparing the battlefield. And would it be too much to say that the Russians have taken advantage of their famous maskirovka because they've been handed a sort of a receptive West that is willing to believe that the Russians are on the run? Haven't really, I have seen no assessments, apart from you, of the buildup of Russian forces being discussed in the Western media. So in effect, the Western media is handing the Russians the benefit of a big surprise moment by being unwilling to talk about what's actually happening.
Well, I think you could say those things. I'm not sure that we could attribute it to Maskirovka. This is this is a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah, I agree.
But the key thing here, and this is something we discussed earlier today with Roger, and that was see two opponents, one Russian, one Ukrainian, sitting on either side of a chessboard. Each side can largely see what the other has.
Right.
This is something we haven't really confronted in the past. There's not much happening on the Russian side that we cannot monitor with space-based surveillance and all the technologies at the National Security Agency, and all of this information is then fed to the Ukrainians on a routine basis. And we have thousands of contractors, former soldiers, and undoubtedly NATO staffs at lower levels taking advantage of this. But what the Russians did not expect, and this has worked to their advantage, is that they would be foolish enough to launch attack after attack after attack for political reasons, to try and demonstrate that there was life left in the Ukrainian armed forces.
Well, that's sort of a projection.
And if you look at Bakhmut,
what we feel.
If you look at Bakhmut right now, this is the topic in the press right now. Bakhmut is being portrayed as a strategically vital logistical hub, rail, everything. And if it is lost, that conceivably that could unhinge the strategic or operational defense in southern Ukraine. I don't know if that's all true, but what we do know is that the Russians have simply held the cheese out for the mice.
Yes.
And said, please come in
Yes.
and defend Bakhmut. So they've held back from actually capturing it in the hopes that more troops would be introduced. They just introduced another 20,000 into Bakhmut a few days ago, half of whom are not Ukrainians. Thousands of Poles, Americans, British, so forth.
I've heard that the Poles have suffered 5,000 casualties.
I know that these are unofficial reports coming to me from people on the ground in Poland that have relatives in Poland and in Ukraine, and they say as many as 1,000 Polish soldiers may have died.
Wow, that would jive with 5,000 casualties.
But this of course is a gift to the Russians, and what's happened now with the economy of force is that the morale down there has risen dramatically,
right.
Because soldiers are always much happier when they see damage inflicted on the enemy. So instead of simply sitting there and waiting for someone to attack, they've managed to manipulate the battlefield.
Yeah.
And with this ISR strike capability, do enormous damage.
Well, let's look just at the near term. It's very hard to look ahead. Those who do it usually get burned and chastised for it. But let's look weeks or maybe a month ahead and talk about what the war termination operation that the Russians hope to launch might look like and what its objectives would be. Not that we know anything about what would actually happen, but if, as I think we're both confident, Mr. Putin does want to have a fourth phase that terminates the war smartly, if not decisively, then what would actually achieve that? So we're not talking about what will happen, but what both of us, mostly you, think would be required to actually achieve a decisive operation.
Well, I think it's important to go back and remember that there was never any intention whatsoever to conquer all of Ukraine.
Right.
Remember, this place is the size of Texas. And to be perfectly frank, the Russians really don't want to have to manage millions of Western Ukrainians who have absolutely no desire to live under Russian rule or government.
Right.
They never did. In fact, Putin, in a speech given back in 2015 or 16, it was sort of a statement he made during a question and answer period. I think it was in St. Petersburg. Somebody asked him, well, what about the Western Ukrainians and what do you think they want and so forth? He said, well, let's be frank. They'd probably be happier under Polish administration than they would be under our administration.
Right.
Didn't bother him in the least. I think what he wants is a clear, unambiguous outcome. Ukrainian armed forces are gone.
Right.
They're devastated, unambiguously defeated. This government in Kiev is gone.
Right.
It's vanishing. Either it is moved to Poland or it is being destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's the first condition. Then the next thing is, well, we're going to redraw this map. Now, I think he would prefer to negotiate over some of that. He would like to have a partner, a strategic partner. But if he has to redraw it, I think he's likely to simply say the Dnieper River is now the western boundary of Russia. I think that's his inclination. And I think at the moment it's the inclination because his fear is, well, let's assume we just take the southern areas, the areas that are traditionally Russian, down to Odessa from Kharkov and call it a day.
It's a long front. It's very vulnerable.
It's vulnerable. It's a long front. And who's to say a future government is not going to try and move over that Dnieper River, build up a force on the western side or on the eastern side, and resume stupid
absolutely.
hostile operations?
That would be a classic standard revanchism, translated into endless military baiting and incessant pinpricks, if not full-scale offensives.
And if he takes our threats seriously,
right,
that we're going to try and turn Ukraine into some form of Afghanistan,
right.
He wants a clear boundary that he can easily defend and monitor what's going on the other side.
So right now, the Ukrainian army has been enticed into the cauldron, a potential cauldron at Bakhmut, which, as you say, the Russians are intentionally not making into a cauldron in order to entice more. If there is an operation, let's just look, if possible, at the operational aspects. People love to draw arrows on a map. Mm-hmm. But what would be an effective operation that would not outrun itself, that would not, in the famous Clausewitzian
Not exhaust
universe,
itself.
yeah, it would not reach the culminating point of attack before achieving its objective. So what would that look like?
Well, there are three very large concentrations of Russian forces.
Okay.
You have the one in southern Ukraine, and this is beyond the troops that were there several months ago.
Right.
And then another concentration east of Kharkov. If you just go due east from Kharkov into western Russia, yes.
Yeah, okay.
In that area, you have another concentration. And then you have a concentration now in White Russia or Belarusia.
Yeah.
And that concentration is probably south of Minsk and between Minsk and maybe just north of the Ukrainian border, west of Kiev.
Yeah, okay.
That's where the major concentrations are. 75,000 Belarusian troops, and the Belarusians have made it clear that they are with the Russians, and the Russians are with them. But most of them are now committed to the border with Poland and Lithuania.
Just on that note, I mean, just recently, very recently, yesterday, there was a sudden surprise announcement that the Belarusian forces will be under Russian command. Is that being done simply as a way to preserve unity of command if those forces are actually launched on an offensive, or is it a way to ensure that nervous Ukrainians who are very worried about Kiev will keep a large percentage of their forces tied up against the Belarusian border?
Well, I think both of those are true. The second one is a more difficult proposition because they're down to about 190,000 effectives left
in the whole
Ukrainian army.
And how big are the numbers that could be unleashed in a Russian offensive?
Well, they've got over 500,000 concentrated in those three areas, and those numbers continue to grow.
And that doesn't include the Belarusian army.
Right, doesn't include the Belarusians. And I think the other part of the issue is Belarusia wants the Western allies in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland to understand that an attack on them will be treated as an attack on Russia.
Right. I think that.
So disabuse them of some notion that they can intervene against Minsk.
So there's powerful symbolism to have this unity.
But they've also said that if the Russians strike south into northern Ukraine, that Belarusia will support that with troops.
Well, I mean, they could. There's always talk about final cutting of the rail links to whatever Ukrainian forces are still left in the east. But is it really necessary to launch a strike south from Belarus, and what would that hope to achieve? What would be the objectives?
Well, this is an interesting question because they have the potential for 2 or 3 operational axes.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the goals of this new offensive will be to permanently cut off Western Poland from Ukraine. In other words, to ensure the Ukrainians are not being supplied any longer with Western weapons over that border. And if you look at the concentration of force that's up there, in broad numbers, we've counted 1,500 tanks, 1,000 rocket artillery systems.
This isn't all three
drone systems. Yeah, it's all three. Thousands of armored fighting vehicles, thousands of conventional artillery.
Yeah.
How these are going to be distributed I'm not privileged to that. I don't know, but I see a substantial enough concentration in Belarusia that it makes sense to strike downwards.
Right.
Which would be west of Kiev,
yes,
but east of the Polish border. And if you look at the map, you can go from Belarusia down to Zhytomyr,
right,
from Zhytomyr to Vinica,
yes,
and it's a short stint then to Moldova.
That's
see, Moldova is important because we've eyed Moldova repeatedly as a potential jump-off point for operations against the Russians in southern Ukraine.
Plus there's Transnistria there.
Yeah. But the bottom line, if you look at that, that's a fairly straightforward. Just by positioning the force there, now Kiev is isolated.
Well, it's somewhat ironic, but several times on Polish television, in news programs, they put up maps of a post-war settlement in which the little bit of Ukraine
Western
that is
Ukraine,
Hungarian would go back to Hungary, the little bit that's Romanian would go back to Romania, and then there are 3 oblasts, which were once part of Poland until not so very long ago.
Yeah.
And so in a way you might have a kind of complicity between Poland and Russia, and what would be left then between the area the oblasts around Lviv would be a rump state of Ukraine, serving as a buffer, and then Russia proper.
Well, see, the nice thing about going to Zhytomyr and then down to Vinnytsia is that you are not confronting a Polish military contingent.
That's true.
And if we are stupid enough to commit 30 or 40,000 U.S. troops 50 or 60 kilometers into western Ukraine, if they sort of take that line, then they could conceivably avoid confronting us.
That's true.
I'm hopeful that we will not do that, because I would think that someone would not want to bankroll or back up Polish annexation of territory or anybody else's annexations. I mean, it's beginning to sound like Czechoslovakia in 1938.
Indeed. Well, it is on people's mind, though.
Oh, of course.
And so, what these little ironical admissions suggest or signal is that, in spite of all the rhetoric, the political rhetoric that is pushed out there, that elites are thinking seriously about a post-war settlement that does not involve the status quo ante for Ukraine, to say the least.
Well, I think it also creates the possibility that whatever settlement emerges will not include Washington.
That's true. And that's another story.
And to be frank, Washington would be smart to stay out of it. Whether or not we're smart enough to do that, I don't know. But anything that can occur without us and it offers stability in some form is probably desirable. And I'm sure from the Russian vantage point, they would be less concerned about the Polish presence, provided it did not symbolize an aggressive NATO presence.
A stalking horse for the U.S.,
yes.
in other words.
And no U.S. missiles and so forth, so on. Now, that, of course, is a huge assumption given the Polish attitudes, which are frankly dangerous.
Well, unfortunately, I agree there. Now, Matt, just to finish out this first part, there are a series of issues that speak to profound misconceptions that Americans have about the conduct of war and operational art. And I just thought we might visit those quickly so that those watching might understand better what is actually going on. In other words, the actual dynamic of battle and the actual way in which the Russians have been performing and succeeding. And the first of those has to do with fortification. And it seems as though the assumption is that Russians cannot break through the intense fortifications that the U.S. and NATO helped the Ukrainians construct over 8 years. And they're fairly extensive. They look like the height of a trench development, pillbox, etc., development in World War I. But the assumption is that the Russians are taking horrendous losses trying to take them. And the issue, it seems to me, is that Americans don't seem to understand that fortifications can delay an offensive, but they can't stop an offensive. Maybe you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, this is something that came up early on. I think we have a very light infantry-centric leadership in NATO.
That's important.
Because of the last 20 years of light infantry operations against very weak insurgents. The British fall into this category naturally, given their imperial past.
Yes.
The French also, although the French, to their credit, I think, have largely stayed out of this, at least in physical terms on the ground. I think the idea of a fortification is appealing because there's an assumption that if you place forces inside a city, everyone has to stop to remove them. Right. But in reality, the opposite is the case. If you are kind enough to immobilize yourself, the enemy is probably going to respect your decision to immobilize yourself and will eagerly surround you, cut off your water, cut off your food, whatever sustenance. You will run out of ammunition, and then you have a choice. You can either surrender or be annihilated while the main body of the force moves on to other locations. This was the sort of Hitlerian approach in World War II. Let's have fortified places, and the Soviet armies will have to stop. No, Soviet armies didn't stop.
That shows at the end of the war in Kurland, for example.
Sure.
You had a whole German army just uselessly boxed in.
Yeah. So I think this is a huge problem for us because it undermines all our assumptions about how we want to fight in the future. Second thing is, we think we found a new technology that will destroy tanks. Well, you've got lots of technologies that have always had them to destroy tanks.
Oh, totally.
It's like minefields. We've always had minefields, millions of mines all over Eastern Europe during World War II, North Africa. It's not a new phenomenon.
Tank begat anti-tank almost
Yeah,
immediately.
of course.
So, yeah.
But what people learn to do is to partner these capabilities with other capabilities that are designed to protect them or enhance them.
Right.
And so you may see a change in the balance. Instead of 100 tanks, there may only be 50 in the future and more of something else.
Right.
But the bottom line is that you end up with a different construct that's designed to exploit that strike capability thanks to ISR. So instead of sitting and waiting for something to happen, you are now moving through the ISR strike
Right.
environment.
Well, this is what has struck me so much about the war in Donbass, where you have this World War I-like buildup of fortification, and how essentially passive the Ukrainians have been. Or if they're not passive, they're like little attacks in World War I. They're suicidal.
Well, they started with very large-scale counteroffensives, 50, 60,000 troops.
Yes.
They've been cut down to company-size elements, relentlessly being hurled against these defenses, which again, as we pointed out, is the Russians have welcomed this, but it is being detrimental to the Ukrainian war effort.
Well, the corollary to talking about fortification, thus, is to talk about fires. And Americans have a completely cartoon-like understanding from the Soviet days, but also just in their head, that somehow Russian fires are massive but indiscriminate, and because they can't be precisely or promptly targeted, are not achieving their goals. And I just would like you to clear up the Russian approach to and success with fires in this war.
The first thing we have to understand is the monopoly on the microcircuitry that was essential to precision
Right.
that we enjoyed in 1991 is gone.
Right.
Soon after the turn of the century, that microcircuitry found its way into Russia and China and elsewhere. The Russians, the Chinese, and anybody that cares to buy their equipment, obviously, now has the ability to attack precisely any point that they can identify, provided they have the range with a weapon system.
Yeah.
So the Russians now have the ability to deliver accurate, devastating firepower with enormous precision,
Yeah.
to the point that immobilizing yourself or sitting still for any great length of time is very dangerous. Now, if you can disappear under 20 feet of concrete or something temporarily, you may survive for a while.
Right.
But it's not a long-term solution. The only long-term solution is some degree of protected mobility, integrated air defenses, and the Russians have demonstrated that their integrated air defenses have been marvelously effective, shooting down things like HIMARS missiles,
Yes.
which we didn't expect.
Absolutely not. And we didn't expect the Iranian cheap but deadly drones either.
That's right.
We thought all innovation is ours.
But clearly, Russia has moved from let's fight this on the cheap
Yeah.
to we're now going to win it and dictate the terms under which we will live in the future in Eastern Europe.
Right.
That's where we're headed. And that's when you begin to look at these axes. Where could they go? Well, clearly the ideal way to handle Ukrainian defenses is to attack them from behind. I would be very surprised if that did not happen, because you have enough forces on the western side, on the eastern side of Kharkov,
Right.
that could easily come across and turn south.
You were saying that the Ukraine on Kharkov, facing Belgorod,
Yeah.
has a very thin screen right now.
Well, it
of
did.
forces.
It did. And they abandoned it. That's why they abandoned it. They had 2,000 men,
Ah.
and they just simply abandoned Kharkov, that entire corridor, all the way down to the river. But my point is they now have a large concentration facing that. That could conceivably be channeled over the river and back into Ukraine. But instead of going north, which is what people would think, oh, we're going to Kiev, no. It turns south. And it meets the other concentration coming up from the south.
Well, let's talk about that.
And let me finish one thing here.
Sure.
These two things I think will happen.
Right.
The real question is what happens in Belarus. And that concentration, if it comes down, it could have the effect that Inchon did.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't remember that what was nice about Inchon was not simply we struck where the enemy was weak, but they were positioned in such a way that the North Korean forces had to retreat. They realized their position was hopeless and started rushing northward for fear that they would be encircled and destroyed. And I think it could make a lot of sense for the Russians to do something similar, and then everyone runs north on the east side of the river to get out of the trap.
Well, the examples we have from history, because now we've gotten into the dynamic that follows fortification and effective fires, and that's the maneuver that occurs after you break through. And essentially the war has in many ways resembled, since, say, April, a siege in the Donbass, or elsewhere as well, all along this 1,100-kilometer front. Now, Americans have assumed that this has to be a Russian breakout, that somehow they have to break through, and because of the distraction, say, of Bakhmut, there is this assumption that the Russians are going to have to bleed themselves white trying to break through the Ukrainian front. Now, you've just laid out ways in which they could get around that. And it also suggests some examples from history where the Gustav Line had held us at the top of Neapolitan Italy, and finally, even though we had a terrible time breaking out, we finally broke out from Anzio, and boom, immediately got to Rome, and the Germans had to retreat to the north. Same with the breakout in Normandy. But what you're suggesting is the conditions for breakout are not so demanding now, A, because the Ukrainian army is much less effective and much weakened, and also that there are areas where a breakthrough would not be that hard. And what I'd like to ask you is, if you could have a breakthrough, say, from Belgorod or from south of Minsk, what would the forces in the south, in the Zaporizhian area, would they try and break through what are strong defenses, or just hold the Ukrainians?
Again, if they can attack simultaneously or near simultaneously from both sides,
everything will crack.
Then it will fall apart quickly.
I see, yeah.
Listen, no one should diminish in any way the fighting skills and power of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians were always good soldiers. They were good soldiers under the Tsars.
Their casualties attest to that.
Yeah, and they were good soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and they were good soldiers in the Soviet army. So I think that's nonsensical, but you can only expect so much from any human being.
Right.
These people have been exhausted. They've been bled white, and they don't have the experienced cadre they once had. By October of 1943, the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, had lost 55,000 officers.
That's stunning.
That's incomprehensible. That means that most of the talent, not all of it, but most of the talent, particularly at the lowest level, these are the people that ran all over Europe for years.
That's right.
They were gone, or they were wounded. And as a result, the German army's offensive striking power after the fall of 43 is dramatically reduced and, quite frankly, inadequate. I think the Ukrainians are in a similar position right now.
Well, when the Russians do launch, will have to be a maneuver offensive to carry out and exploit and reach their goals. Have the Russians adapted in ways that will, in terms of their combat unit organization and in terms of the manner of how the offensive will unfold, sort of leave behind the unwieldy kind of organizational structure of divisions and corps and armies that most Americans think of in terms of maneuver warfare?
Well, they really already have. When they went through a series of reforms, you ended up with the vast majority were in what I would call large mobile brigade groups. These are usually 5,000 to 6,000, sometimes 4,000 to 5,000, sometimes 3,000. Depends on whether this is a tank-heavy operation or mostly motorized infantry or something, or mechanized infantry. They do have motorized rifle divisions. They are 8,000 men strong. They're the largest formations in the Russian army, but they have been used primarily as assembly areas. In other words, bring it in and then commit it to other formations to fight, as opposed to sending in a division-sized unit. All of these formations are commanded by generals. And what we did see, even with the battalion tactical groups, which was a new innovative approach, which had some merit. I think RUSI is saying the Russians have abandoned it. I'd be surprised if that were the case, but they're the only ones saying it. But they did have situations where they had one of these brigade group headquarters that was managing 7 or 8 of these battalion tactical groups simultaneously. We're much more rigid in our thinking as we were in 1942, 43, and 44. So it's incomprehensible that we would do business that way. But the Russians, even towards the end of the war, would have as many as 7 to 10 divisions under one army headquarters, which was a corps equivalent. Unthinkable for us.
That's right.
But it gained enormous ground quickly.
So you have generals commanding brigades then
Yes.
in Russia.
Yeah.
That's something that you don't have in the US.
Well, the British Army does. The British
Right,
Army has brigade battle groups. But they don't usually have more than 4
Right.
combat battalions in a brigade battle group. But, the Russians are demonstrating, we can do better.
That's an old British.
They're more flexible and agile in this sense.
The second part of our conversation addresses the question of why NATO is failing so badly at a strategic level, and the extent to which this has become a proxy war that has galloped out of control, because it is a proxy war run on deceit and denial. And this would seem to be unimaginable in the sense that the narrative entering into this war was that Russia, and specifically Mr. Putin, were an expression of pure evil, and that America was seizing the leadership that it had so divinely grasped, the reins of the good, if you will, in World War II. And yet what we see actually is that the United States and its NATO allies, especially Britain, have engaged in a war of propaganda and deception. And of course, this is constituted essentially distributing Ukrainian propaganda, which understandably wants to ensure victory, and that, of course, its greatest hope would be to suck NATO into direct confrontation with Russia. And yet, the United States and Britain primarily have engaged in a larger propaganda war, both to aid Ukrainian propaganda. At one point, there were at least 250 public relations firms working for the Ukrainian government, helping it to get its message out. But also, the U.S. intelligence community has organized an entire ecology of Twitter users and others on social media to not only push out the Ukrainian message, but to actually obscure what is going on the ground. And American government officials have engaged in a kind of deception effort that one could only assume, knowing its dimensions, of being deliberate and deliberately orchestrated. And the question is, why would the U.S. do that? And more pointedly, and flowing from this effort to portray the war in a light that constitutes nothing less than sheer fantasy, what does this say about the American government and its military's ability to actually engage in actual reality? In other words, to conduct a net assessment that deals with things as they are and not as we wish them to be. And I guess that may be too overarchingly broad a question for you, Colonel, but it nonetheless has to be addressed. I mean, the U.S. Across the entirety of this war has represented what is going on falsely. Why is that? And what does it say about us?
Yeah, well, I think we do have to understand, just to some extent, how much the NATO alliance has evolved over the last 50, 60 years. I mean, keep in mind that the alliance that emerges in the 1950s and 60s has a predetermined, unambiguous enemy to point to.
Right.
That begins to fall apart by the time you get into the 80s.
Right.
And at the end of 89, it vanishes. And long before we came to the realization that the Soviet state apparatus and its armed forces and its control of Eastern Europe was not quite what it was represented to be, the Europeans understood that far, far quicker. The Germans, I think, the Austrians, who were not in the alliance, but they're nevertheless a co-participant in Central East Europe. And I think the Swedes and Danes and others saw that Russia was failing. And there was an understanding that there probably wouldn't be a war.
Right.
Then the decision has to be made, what do we do with this thing called NATO? I mean, alliances are difficult to hold together in a war. And, you know, if you're trying to hold an alliance together in peacetime, it's much more difficult. But one of the things you do is you create an enemy for it. And we went through this in the 1990s of if NATO is either out of area or out of business. And I was on active duty and I heard these things in 95 in connection with Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I began to hear people in the Clinton administration talk about, well, we're beginning a democratic revolution in the Balkans. And this revolution will ultimately sweep all the way to Moscow. Of course, I thought they were certifiable. And so did many of the European officers. But unfortunately, there were many Europeans in positions of authority in government that seemed to believe that this sort of thing was going to happen. And that you would get the Urals to the Atlantic on American terms.
Right.
And as a result, we end up with this strange situation where NATO is no longer truly a defensive alliance,
Right.
but becomes an offensive instrument in the hands of Washington. Now, there's another reason for that, and this is what Americans don't understand. There is no command, control, communications, computer, C4SR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance backbone. There is no command structure with all the supporting assets that is European.
Right.
It is all American.
Right.
Anything that happens in Europe militarily is of necessity American, because if you take that backbone away,
Yeah.
no one can replace it. Now, the Europeans volunteered for this set of circumstances. They were only too willing to make them vassals of the United States. One way to think of Europe and the United States is to compare the Greek city-states to Rome.
Yes. Yes.
The Greek city-states invited the Roman legions to come in and rid them of a Macedonian king they didn't like, and then ultimately the Roman state. Now, in truth, the Greeks and the Romans did manage to get along reasonably well, but that was effectively the end of Greek dominance in any sense of the word, militarily or politically or economically.
You're describing an interesting evolution of empire. And of course, as you point out, NATO was an alliance. Mm-hmm. It was preeminently and visibly a military alliance. Mm-hmm. And the Soviet threat, quote unquote, was a real threat. Mm-hmm. And the overarching dominance of the U.S. in the recent war, World War II, was seen as the ultimate security blanket. And then in the wake, and you bring this up in a very powerful way, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, mm-hmm. NATO's raison d'etre all but evaporated. And your comment helps to explain why the U.S. didn't make a more concerted effort to bring the former states of the Soviet Union all together, including the Russian Federation, into NATO. And in fact, found a way to begin to reposition Russia objectively as a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes, a new enemy. Mm-hmm. And I think you also pointed out why this happened, because the distracting wars in the former Yugoslavia and the Middle East, in which NATO found itself paradoxically and strangely engaged in the middle of Central Asia, didn't continue to keep the bonds of dependency strong. In fact, it began to weaken them. And NATO, I think, its very cohesion.
Well, you had one other event that tended to reinforce American dominance and control, and that, of course, was the 1991 Gulf War.
Yes.
People looked at that and said, clearly, there's no one in the world that has access to the technology and the capabilities of the United States. And so I remember, I think it was Time or Newsweek that had a headline that showed American soldiers in the desert and said, "Where will they go next?" And of course, within no time, you have Madeleine Albright,
Yes.
who meets with General Powell and says, "You keep talking about this great army. Well, why can't we use it?" And of course, Powell's view was, well, that's a last resort. American military power is not the first resort, but the last resort.
Right.
And we were transformed at that point into kind of a 9/11 force.
Yeah.
That wherever the political leadership decided to send us, we would go and somehow or another muddle through and make things right. Well, that hasn't worked out very well.
No, I mean, we became, you call it a light infantry ethos, but it was really, in terms of its employment and deployment, a kind of SWAT team military.
Yes.
And during that period, the U.S. dominance was so great that European militaries began to slough off the things that made them credible as militaries.
Yes.
I mean, the French stopped conscription, for
Yes.
example. Germany's tank park is down to 200 tanks. The Netherlands gave up all of its tanks. So you have a kind of devolution into vestigial NATO militaries that aren't even like the old legions of the Roman Soci, the Roman allies. They're not equivalent in any way. They're sort of like accessories.
Yes,
to the
no,
US.
that's right. And the bad news is that having transformed themselves into effectively vassal states,
Yes.
they're no longer in a position where they once were. If you go back to someone like Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, he was in Key West talking to JFK
That's a terrible moment.
about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then later on, JFK talked to him about the potential for Vietnam. And Macmillan said, out of the question. We won't participate in that. This changes, and
Right.
Britain becomes a true vassal state, as opposed to, admittedly, once a great power, but still a force to be reckoned with, to the point where we would actually listen
Right.
to good advice.
You know, the British had the life, in a way, kicked out of them because you had Suez and Anthony Eden, where Eisenhower basically pulled the leash on
Yeah.
Britain and France. But that was followed again by this critical Key West meeting where Macmillan was humiliated because the U.S. had sucked Britain into replacing its deterrent delivery from the Blue Steel bomb to the advanced Skybolt, which was an airborne ballistic missile. And of course that just got canceled because it's a boondoggle program. And so Macmillan had to come hat in hand to the Bahamas and beg for Polaris missiles. And that was a real blow to Britain. And I think the real blow came later when the British abandoned their east of Suez. And most people forget the fact that in 1966, in the face-off between the new Malaysia and Indonesia, the British had over 60,000 troops and a fleet with 3 carriers, and it was a kind of a magnificent force. And that was the last major deployment, imperial deployment, but also deployment that gave the British the kind of place in the hierarchy where they could be the sidekick of the U.S. in an important way. And they tried symbolically, like in Desert Storm, they had the Desert Rats there. Then they had a division in southern Mesopotamia during the Iraq War. None of these gave the British enough cred. And so I think your term vassal state, which is used more and more increasingly around town, is an essential term to use, just as American empire is essential. Because when you have an empire, it's not about how much the imperial center administers its colonies. It doesn't have to be about colonies at all. It's about the relationship between the imperial center, the imperial court, and its client states. And when you're a vassal state, you are completely dependent upon and at the mercy of the imperial center.
However, the empire does occasionally strike back.
Yes.
And we now have lots of little states in Europe that
Right.
have joined this thing called NATO
Right.
that are very interested in leveraging American power,
Right.
military, political, economic, for their narrow interests.
Yeah.
A wonderful example of that, of course, is Poland.
Poland.
And I would say Lithuania that sits next door.
And Estonia and Latvia. I mean, these are tiny countries.
But they
Not
all,
Poland, but the Baltics are.
But they all have an agenda.
They do indeed.
And we have never sat down and clearly understood that those agendas are not necessarily our agendas. That we like these people and we want to do business with these people. And if they are attacked, we're happy to defend or help defend these people. And we know that they will fight. That's not up for discussion. The problem is we don't want to be dragged into any aspirational operations such as the Poles in Ukraine.
On the other hand, these countries are all the more loyal to us, the more dependent they become, and their very dependency becomes an excuse for elevating the threat. And the recreation of the Russian threat is in many ways essential to preserving the absolute dominance, even supremacy, of the American empire called NATO. And it is still, however, paradoxical why we would be so intensely focused, not simply on using Russia and the Russian threat as a way to keep NATO completely under our thumb, but actually going so far as to embrace the idea of Russian evil to the point where we will overextend ourselves, as we have, in this dangerous proxy war. And I'm wondering, what thoughts do you have on why the U.S. would go so far out on a limb, get so emotionally hysterical, especially among what I call the blue elites in the imperial court, the current administration?
Yeah. Well, remember, we're not talking about the American people.
Right.
They haven't been asked about any of this.
Right.
We don't consult them, and frankly, most of them don't care. So we have to do exactly what you've just done and be very specific about the well-financed minorities here in the capital,
Yes,
who are pursuing these things. And by the way, your overextension and the same kinds of dangerous implications apply to Asia. And we're not looking carefully at those either. Now, I think it's useful to consider the following. I think that we don't understand the extent to which we are overextended, first of all.
right.
There's a wonderful chapter written by Corelli Barnett in The Collapse of British Power. It's called Covenants Without Swords.
Yeah.
And he explains how in the 20s and the 30s, the British began making all of these commitments around the world for which they had no forces to sustain. He said, so they end up going to war in 1939, completely unprepared for the global implications and the commitments, and they never really come to terms with it. So what they do is impoverish themselves by relying exclusively on us to bankroll them. We not only bankroll them, we equip them. And so it's the first step on the road to vassal state status.
Yeah.
And that begins during World War II. I think it was by the end of 41 or the beginning of 42, the British were effectively bankrupt. They had nothing left.
They're bankrupt, and they'd also managed to get themselves in threat situations in 3 theaters against Japan, Italy in the Mediterranean, and then Germany. And before that, during the Winter War in Finland, the French and the British were ready to bomb the Soviet Union.
Yeah, of course.
Which would have consolidated a Nazi-Soviet Eurasia along with Japan and China.
Absolutely.
And yet they were willing to do that for what?
Well,
this gets down, because this is very much like the U.S. today, I think.
Well, this is also where you need a strategic reassessment in the sense that I hear people all the time, well, what about we want America to be first. And you don't sound to me like you want to be an American first guy. You want to be an American last guy. And I said, well, why do you say that? Well, you don't really want to go out there and confront these evil people. And so I said, there's something to be said for hanging back and letting your potential opponent overextend himself. Right now, we've done the opposite. We've overextended ourselves. We're actually a very fragile grip on all the things that we think we control. We see that in the finance markets. We see it economically. We don't produce in this country as we once did. We're not even defending our borders, and yet we're courting outright war in a part of the world where most Americans have never been and don't even understand.
Well, let's unpack that, because this is something that I don't think is come together as a set of relational dynamics driving America to the situation in the past that it's in today. And I think one of those has to be a over assessment, a mixture of complacency, arrogance, vanity, entitlement, a belief that the American military is supreme, so that it is not only the sharpest arrow in your quiver, it's also the element that never fails. And what strikes me as ironic and mysterious is the fact that it's failed again and again since the 1960s, and yet somehow we are entranced by our own symbols of power and continue to use them, in part because we have such faith in their talismanic power, their ability to keep us strong. How did that happen, if you want to just sum that up, because that's an important long-term secular trend?
I think there's a perception that the American military has never been defeated.
Right.
Which of course is misleading, if not outright wrong.
Well, Harry Summers said that, was never defeated in battle.
Yes.
In Vietnam, yeah.
Yet we found it impossible to win the war.
Right.
So I think that has to be re-examined. There are various ways you win and lose, and this goes back to the attrition model we were discussing before. You can expend all your resources and be defeated not by the enemy, but by your own stupidity. That, I think, is what's happening to some extent in Ukraine, although admittedly I think the Russians are doing far more what's right than what's wrong. I think we're not even in the game. We're not even considering these things. We're not looking at any of our potential vulnerabilities. We only see what we believe to be strengths, but those strengths, in many cases, haven't recently been tested. And if you fight someone like Russia, those things will be tested. And this is also something that I hope we would talk a little bit about. This is some of the work that you've done on identity.
Yeah.
Where if I see anything, I see a stronger Russia, a more cohesive societal structure in Russia.
Right.
Greater faith and confidence in the Russian state and in Russian nationalism. And I don't see that happening in Europe. In fact, this is the problem with this NATO alliance. There are diverging interests. People in Berlin are looking at what's going on in Poland and have concluded the Poles have lost their minds. They're not interested in being part of a war in Russia. I don't know of anybody in Italy or Greece or France or Spain that's interested in being dragged into a war with Russia.
This is a really pertinent question that takes us to the heart of how our worldview has become so distorted. And I think part of it is structural. In the sense of what happens to an imperial court-centric ruling class and ruling system. And part of it is the loss of insight that goes along with that process of becoming, a navel-gazing courtier class. And in America, ever since the Clinton administration, but including all those that came after, with the possible exception of Mr. Trump, has seen the rise of a global elite, championing words like globalization, gathering by the hundreds in their private jets at Davos every January, and increasingly separate and cut off from the pulse of the actual nation, of the American people.
Well, of course, this was exactly Corelli Barnett's argument.
Yes.
That the British ruling classes had this vision of England, primarily, that didn't exist anymore, that had vanished as a result of the First World War. And we have a similar situation right now. If you ask the ruling elites here about America, they wax eloquently about America. Well, have you visited it lately? I talked to someone the other day who insisted that, this inflation isn't all that bad and we can master this and get by. And I said, drive 100 miles west, 100 miles north, or 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., and go to the food banks and look at the lines of people in the food banks waiting to be fed. I said, things are not good. But this same sort of disconnect is there. But we, unlike Great Britain, don't have the United States that's going to march in and supplant what we don't have with their capabilities.
Well, this is a powerful aspect about this ruling class and this ruling class ethos of globalization. Is that on one hand, again, since Clinton all the way up to 2016 at the very least, and then again after 2020, there has been this almost conscious deindustrialization of the U.S. In other words, during those administrations, the U.S. actively allowed 50% of our manufacturing base to move to China. Some of it to Mexico, but it changed the balance in the global economy. And they don't care about borders. In fact, they want more cheap labor in the U.S. And they have a ruling ethos that is not really connected to the preceding ethos, which was the American ethos, which was a more unitary, if hardly monolithic, but more unitary concept of the nation. They don't have a concept of the nation. They have a concept of a world elite class. And what that does is it puts them and their worldview in a context where they use the word identity as a political cudgel. And identity to them is just another tactic in their attempt to seize and control power. Actual identity, as in the old nation, is something that exists in Russia, and it's extremely powerful. But they have lost the capacity to understand the existence of that identity. They can only see it as something to be expunged somehow.
Well, the sad part is our European contemporaries, our colleagues in all of those governments have gleefully participated in the systematic deindustrialization of their societies and the destruction of national identity.
Except for Hungary.
Yeah, with the exception of Hungary. And I would say also with the exception, interestingly enough, of the Poles.
Oh, yeah.
But
That's true.
the thing, though, is that, and dare I mention his name, who is normally viewed as the Antichrist inside the Beltway, and that's Donald Trump, who made the argument that the Europeans had to become their own first responders. It's a very simple statement. But being your own first responder automatically translates into some degree of sovereignty, independence, judgment, thought, strategy, all of which have been swept away through 50, 60 years of NATO.
Well, the humorist might say that Mr. Trump was offering effectively tough love and essentially saying, you don't want to be a vassal? Here's what you have to do.
That's
you want to be your own actual nation? Here's what you have to do.
But there's also another part of this vision that's very important, and that is that we see the world as this multipolar place.
Yeah.
And that's not an unhealthy thing.
No.
And increasingly we see regions emerging, regional structures, regional organizations, which is something Hedley Bull predicted many years ago in the 70s and the 60s. You can view that as positive, or you can see it as negative. Now, if you're an imperialist, you live in Versailles on the Potomac, oh, that's terrible, because that means you no longer have control.
Yes.
And ultimately, it's our control which is the issue in this war with Russia.
Yeah, and we've paradoxically undone our control. The last levers we have are financial.
Yes.
And we've even undone and dismissed in the last couple of years energy,
Yes.
which is a very powerful lever.
Yes.
And we've let the military slide even in the last 2 years as well. Even the most ready and most revered, sacred weapon in our quiver, we have let it rust.
Well, to some extent, one wonders if we're not similar to the Prussian army on its way to Jena, Auerstedt.
Oh yeah, and it couldn't conceive of itself being not the best.
They sort of maintained this relic as a tribute to the great achievements of Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. Didn't turn out to be very effective when it encountered the Grand Army under Napoleon. And I think that we fall into that category so much, which leads us to how do we engage in a sobering self-assessment?
Well, if I could introduce the final chink, or the final piece that has come out as a chink in our situation, and that is that this this blue globalist elite, for want of a better descriptive term, has become itself dependent on its anger and hatred of Russia. And I think in large part this is a case of being hoist to your own petard. The last thing we needed to do is get into a war with Russia. And yet somehow the political ploys that we've been talking about, that you mentioned, of of re-ensnaring NATO, restitching their vassal status by using Russia, at some point got out of hand. You could say it was 2014, after it still sort of hasn't tipped over. But I think what we saw in 2016 with the emergence of this mythology of the Russian bacterium, that it was infecting our body politic, and it was evil, with metaphorical examples like the infection that are similar to what we did with the communists, also to the Nazis. What it did, it created a kind of emotional imbalance. You might even want to sort of compare it to a psychosis, in which our judgment has been degraded.
Oh, absolutely.
Our strategic judgment. So when you ask the question of why don't we step back and see things as they really are, and reassess our situation and take remedial steps, we're admired in our own emotion. I say this because I listen to all of these people in Congress, the writers, the people in the mainstream media, and they really believe what they're saying. Mm-hmm. So this, to me, might help to explain why the elite has created this fantasy about the war and stuck so doggedly to it, and attacked so relentlessly anyone who tried to bring up a criticism or different analysis.
Well, there's no doubt that this war, on an ideological level, is inextricably intertwined with all of the other misconstrued ideas and confused mindsets that you're mentioning. I don't know that there's an easy solution, but something's going to happen in the near future.
Right.
This is going to collapse. This narrative is going to fail. It's just like all these supposed Russian atrocities. And many of us have looked at these accusations and allegations and found wanting.
Right.
They just don't hold up. On the other hand, the Ukrainian forces have done some very terrible things.
Just regular Ukrainians to other Ukrainians.
Yes.
Over the last 8 years.
Yeah. And so this is all going to collapse. And the question is, when it collapses, will we be able to do what you just described, step back? Now, there's one thing working in our favor, and that is that more and more Americans are saying, you want to march into Ukraine with 40,000 troops,
right,
and 30,000 Polish troops, and 20,000 Romanian troops? What's wrong with our borders? Why don't we protect our borders? What are we doing for our own national security? This is a legitimate question, and it's beginning to come up more and more. People are not happy with the situation.
Well, in our conversation, I think we've come to an interesting discovery. That is that if you have a courtier class that is in control at this point of the imperial court and is giving orders to the American military that run the risk of a further escalation out of proxy war into direct actual war, then this is, as it were, the kind of hinge of fate that we have to face. And in many ways, it suggests that military leaders at some point will have to say no for us not to get into a dangerous situation. And I think there have been some tiny hints of that with Milley.
Well, my classmate, Ray Odierno, who passed away not long ago, when he was chief of staff, she said, I hear people telling us to do more with less. He said, why can't we do less with less? And it's a legitimate question, and that was about as far as he was willing to go. I wish he'd gone further, but it's true. And it's back to covenants without swords. Right. We have a shrinking military establishment. We have a military establishment right now which, for a whole range of reasons, a lot of people don't want to serve in. And then we have 30 years of senior officer selection that have led to a group of senior leaders that, frankly, most of us on any normal day would not follow, even out of idle curiosity.
I know.
They don't have any gut-wrenching experiences in their background. They don't exhibit professional depth.
I've taught many of them.
Yeah. Well, then it's partially your fault, I guess.
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
My point is that we seem to have preferred people that were anxious to go along. Oh yes, of course. If that's what you want, that's your new policy. We'll support it. Whatever it is, just promote me.
The key, and the reason I'm responding here is that apart from my culpability, there is a larger culpability in the military education system which reflects a sclerosis of thinking. in the 186-page syllabus of the strategy and policy course at the Naval War College, the word critical thinking was used 100 times. And yet, all you had to do to ace that course was just get all of the correct answers that were in the 186 pages. And it was effectively a formula, just as all of the little stratagems, I won't call it strategy because it's been stratagems, like counterinsurgency, have been formula. And the formula doesn't work because it's self-serving and self-satisfying. And it strikes me that when this big offensive occurs, so let's tie this to the military picture that we addressed in the first part. And Americans have been so misled, and the fantasy, the souffle of heady aromas that have infused the elite will suddenly collapse. And at that point, there will be those who want to dramatically escalate, like the neocons, and like the most neoliberal blues and blue courtiers. And so that will, I think, be the moment of greatest danger in this entire war. And that'll be the moment when the military leadership's going to have to step up. The problem is, bringing in military education again, is that the entire point in the War College course that I taught all those years was to accommodate and appease civilian leadership in return for autonomy and control and money to preserve your lifestyle.
Yes.
That's not a healthy relationship when you're on the cusp of World War III.
No, I think so. And you know, I served in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff, and one of the things that I could never find was a clear statement of U.S. vital strategic interests.
Right.
Which one would look for as the justification for force structure, contingency planning, and so forth. Instead, you had these vague things. Well, we may have to fight 2 near simultaneous conflicts. And then we might have to fight one and then something else, maybe.
A lesser contingent.
And on and on and on. But there was no, these are the things important. You know, go back to World War II, and I think this has been a problem for us for a long time. If you go back to General Marshall and his meetings with the British that begin actually before the war is declared privately, but then during the war, these conferences in Morocco and Tehran and so forth, we would walk in and there would be 12 officers or 10 officers with Marshall, and the British would walk in and all of their officers were carrying map cases and books of papers and things. And the British would roll out these maps and show where every oil field was located, where every port was located, where every rail line. We had nothing. And so they said, well, what are you doing? We're defeating Germany. We're defeating Japan. What do you want this to look like when the war's over? What do you want out of this? What do we want the world to look like? I mean, the British were thinking about those things. Of course, they're imperialists. They've been at this for hundreds of years. But we learned almost nothing from this. Well, we're still lost.
If we are chosen by God to be His agent to redeem humanity, why should we look at anyone else? But I think, again, you raise another missing piece here, which is, if you look at World War II, we didn't have, like in the 70s or 80s, a 1.5 war strategy or 2 war strategy. We had a 6 war strategy. We fought at least 6 wars: China, Burma, India, Southwest Pacific, the Navy in the Pacific, the Battle of the Atlantic, the war in Italy, and then the war in, the North German plain. And we did it because we had everything. We had limitless everything.
Almost limitless.
Well,
there were still limits. We don't admit to them.
No, but we produced 80,000 combat aircraft in 1944. We gave thousands and thousands of aircraft to the Russians, et cetera, et cetera.
But remember, there was a letter that was sent from Marshall to Eisenhower. And he said, look, you've got all the divisions you're going to get. This is in January, in the midst of the bulge.
90,
yeah. You've got to fight this thing and win it. You're not going to get anything else. We can't do it.
Yeah.
We have all these other commitments, so get on with it and win the war. Well, it was an interesting letter, and
it's powerful.
But it was very important for Eisenhower. And this is something, and I'm not here to discuss whether he was a great president or a bad president. That's another issue entirely. But he did come to the presidency with a very acute sense of just how limited our resources really were and our manpower. And he saw the Second World War through a very different lens from, say, Kennedy or Nixon, who were in the fleet in the Pacific and were starry-eyed and amazed at the masses of ships and everything else. Didn't understand that it all came at a cost.
This is a super point, and the fact that we had, again, using the Clausewitz nugget of, the culminating point of attack, we'd reached the culminating point of attack against Japan.
Yes.
I don't know that we could have pulled off the invasion of Japan or accepted, as a nation, the millions of casualties we would have.
Well, this is your point on Okinawa that is not widely appreciated.
Well, we lost 100,000 casualties on Okinawa and Iwo Jima together, and that's what the Japanese lost. And in other words, they lost fewer. They weren't dead, but to us, it was the casualties that mattered. And the fact is, that was a lesson that Eisenhower absorbed. But generations after him, especially, as you pointed out, the best and the brightest who started VM, they never imbibed that, and even less so, the feckless generations that are now the courtiers at the imperial court.
So when you're talking today about the terrible possibility that we might send this coalition of the willing from Poland some distance into Ukraine, which was described by General Petraeus,
yes,
there is an acute failure to understand what that really means. How many replacements do you have standing behind these forces to replace the wounded? Because you have to assume that the Russians are not going to sit there and ignore the presence of this force in front of them. How many repair parts? How much fuel? How many days of ammunition? We could just go down the list. I don't think we've sat down and done the calculus.
Well, this may be the final point of America's strategic weakness and inflexibility, and that is the holy narrative of World War II. And one thing that I'm getting, not just out of the memories of my father's generation talking about the war that were passed on, but also the way in which so much of the rhetoric coming from the blue elite and the mainstream media has tried to recreate the emotional sort of uplift, the emotional high that we had in World War II and afterwards. Almost as though the World War II experience is the thing that we really want to get out of this war, and we thought we could do it on the cheap. And I think one of the reasons the elites rushed to embrace this war is that suddenly the prospect opened up, or rose up, of another ecstatic realization. World War II for the American people was an ecstatic realization. War can do that.
Yes.
War can do the opposite, as we see in World War I.
Yes.
But the ecstatic realization is what the Washington blue courtier elite desperately wanted. They wanted somehow to be the lineal descendants of the people who fought World War II. That is what unnerves me about the coming weeks.
Here's a thought that may end up being a useful sort of conclusion.
Yeah.
Just before we went into Iraq in 2003, and I had a modest role in that by being asked to design an approach that would, at that point in time, get us in and then facilitate a rapid withdrawal.
Right.
Of course, that all changed, but that's another story. But I was watching all the preparations, and there were discussions about these forces are deploying and so forth. And a woman was interviewed in Washington, D.C., who lived in a not very nice neighborhood.
Yeah.
And she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said, well, I sure wish the U.S. Army would come to my neighborhood and occupy it and get rid of all these drug dealers and criminals.
Wow.
And here we are preparing to move 6,000 miles away to deal with something that in retrospect was, in strategic terms, a pimple.
Yeah.
And at home, what has happened? She was right.
Yeah.
She made an excellent point. And I think that ultimately more and more Americans will come to that conclusion, and it may be the American electorate that rises up and saves us.
Well, the correlation, if you will, between the domestic upheaval and conflict in the U.S. and the fecklessness and yet absolute danger of this imbroglio in Ukraine is, I think, the most salient and urgent issue for Americans to enjoy.
And then I think in the final analysis, what we need to take from all of this is the understanding of this paradigm shift in warfare.
Yeah.
This is the ISR strike connectivity.
Let's get to that then in part 3.
Okay.
So, for our third movement, as it were, the questions are, what is to be done? And where do we go from here? And given all of the many themes and tropes and topi that we've covered, to tie them together, I'm going to turn to Colonel McGregor's recent book, Margin of Victory, and give a little excerpt just to tee things up. And as Doug says, when the tables turn as they did, referring to 5 battles that constitute the book, when the tables turn as they did, bad policies, failed tactics, and dysfunctional command structures have to be abandoned, period. Policymakers and commanders whose ideas were wrong must be discarded and replaced with new policymakers and new commanders, as well as new strategic and operational concepts. The first order questions in national military strategy have to be posed anew, within the strategic and operational framework of purpose, method, and end state. Yet, if culture and leadership obstruct this process of adaptation and change in war, the margin of victory is permanently lost. This is the nub of it, because as we discussed in the first movement, Russia has shown itself capable of adapting, capable of reaching back to historical antecedents, like the Brusilov offensive, like the entirety of the Great Patriotic War, and they have adapted in ways that Americans cannot bring themselves to understand. And in contrast, and I mean in stark 180-degree contrast, the United States military and its political leaders have not only not adapted, they've consistently extended and extruded a delusionary understanding of what is actually happening. And this is remarkable. And so in our last part, I want to turn to you, Colonel, and ask you what you would recommend to get us to change and adapt in a context where nothing over the last 60 years has achieved anything close to that.
Well, just to extend your opening comments somewhat, there is always a lag time between the identification of what has changed and its understanding. The Russians have obviously managed that more effectively, at least thus far. We'll see how this offensive unfolds.
Right.
If the offensive fails miserably and shows little evidence of what we think is going to happen, well, then we're wrong. But I don't think that's going to be the case. But having said that, it's very difficult to persuade people who have not grasped the shift in the way things are being done and the way things should be done. Sometimes that shift is cultural, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's economic. What can we actually afford versus what we want? And you don't get the necessary change. It's Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And the principal paradigm shift today, it goes back to the first part of our discussion. And that is that we can sit across from each other and know virtually everything about the other person, the other side. We can strike everything with a standoff attack system. And there's no way to hide from it. There are ways to defeat it.
Yeah.
Hiding from it is much more difficult. So what you see, you can destroy. And of course, we had a taste of this in the 70s where people said, if you can see it, you can shoot at it.
Right.
If you can shoot at it, you can hit it. If you can hit it, you can destroy it. Okay, fine. This was just a tank shooting at a tanker zone. We're way beyond this at this point. And that paradigm shift is this ISR strike coupling. And we tend on the ground to think in terms of, well, we're the maneuver force and where we go is going to win the battle. Well, the problem today is that unless you have mastered the ISR strike dimension, you're never going to get there. You're never going to have a chance to maneuver. Your maneuver force is going to be destroyed, whether it's getting off the beachhead or landing at the airstrip or anything else. And that's something that's very hard for people that have never seen it to grasp.
Just as a point of information here, are the ancient origins of this at all in the Soviet reconnaissance strike?
Oh, absolutely. That was the first serious intellectual attempt to come to terms with this reality. And of course, Ogarkov, and one of his star performers was Mahmoud Gareev, who wrote very recently, when I say recently, 20 years ago, it all depends on your perspective, If War Comes Tomorrow. And he addresses all of these things in the Russian context. And how do you cope? How do you adapt? And I think the Russians have come a long way. But remember, Putin initially was building a force that was designed to exclusively defend Russia.
Yeah.
Now he's compelled to do something different. He's compelled to build an offensive strike instrument with which to deter and potentially destroy opponents. This is the great gift that the blue elites that you're talking about have given to us. They've resuscitated the very thing they said they were setting out to stop.
But even here, as we've talked, Putin is at heart a cautious leader, commander. And, again, following after Montgomery and also what we see in Surovikin. But the fact is that he has to design an offensive weapon that doesn't overextend itself.
Right.
And then expend itself in the effort.
Yeah. Well, he's more sensitive to that than we are.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Obviously, we are not even thinking intelligently about it, or we would not even consider something as utterly crazy as the coalition of the willing.
Right.
Unless the coalition of the willing is close to 1 million men and consists of a very different composition from the forces we have today. So when you look at the U.S. military today, we have to ask the question, what are we and what do we want to do? Well, the first thing is that we have historically never been a land power on a global basis. In other words, we're really a land power only in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, we were an expeditionary power even at our height in World War II with 90 divisions deployed.
Of course. But the point is that we came out of that war with the delusion that we are a global land power.
That's right.
And we're not. And that we don't have the staying power to be a global land power. It's sort of the difference between an insular or a continental power and a maritime power. We're preeminently maritime and aerospace. And we have sufficient ground capability that we can deal with anything in our hemisphere. So we've got to get back to basics and understand that our ability to influence things is really confined more than ever in history to the periphery.
Yeah.
On the Eurasian periphery, we can influence things, but we cannot strike deep into the Eurasian landmass. I mean, it's essentially what Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said. Anyone who talks about a war in Asia, land war in Asia, should have his head examined. Well, thank you, Bob.
Well, we knew this.
What did you do to stop that?
We knew this in the 40s when Nicholas Spikeman was writing, for example.
But the thing is that we don't understand now with this ISR strike paradigm shift, the notion of occupying little islands all over the Pacific is a prescription for immediate strategic failure and destruction. Has no purpose whatsoever. And the notion that you can act with impunity the way we did in the past with large surface fleets, those days are over. And how many armies can we transport overseas?
Right.
I think those days are over.
Right.
So then what are we doing with all these regional unified commands? How many do we really need? Today, communications are vastly improved over what they were 40 or 50 years ago. When this regional unified command structure first came into existence, the first person to talk about it was Eisenhower. He wasn't able to implement it. It took failure under Jimmy Carter with the Air Force One and so forth to begin the movement in this direction, get you Goldwater, Nichols, and everything else. But the bottom line is that things have changed since then. So you could conceivably have 2 regionally unified commands, east-west, and maybe 2 more north-south. And they can manage everything. And then you can treat your forces as a pool of forces that can be deployed on short notice in any direction. but only on a limited basis. In other words, not deploying
Exactly.
100,000 men to country X in Central Asia or down in South Africa.
Well, ironically, this was historically the British formula in the 18th century, but especially after the defeat of Napoleon, and it worked for 100 years, and then it all fell apart, and Britain found itself expending its national strength in two world wars.
Well, again, to go back to Corelli Barnett and others, he's not the only one. If you go back and look at the way they treated Bonaparte,
Right.
they ceased fire on Bonaparte several times. There were arrangements made for ceasefires, arrangements of new peace deals, because they understood this is a long-term process, and we're not going to accomplish everything within a short span of time. We know what Bonaparte's about, and we're going to continue to be opposed to him, but we have to look for and develop the situation that's favorable. We don't think in those terms because, once again, there's no long-term perspective. And that, I think, is because until now, we never really thought we needed it.
Yeah.
And as you've pointed out, when we have failed miserably, and I think you're right, since 1965, where's the evidence for success?
I know.
Well, Desert Storm. Well, fine, Desert Storm. What did Desert Storm do? For a short time, it convinced everyone in the world that we were invincible, invulnerable, and so forth. However,
But that was actually destructive.
yeah, it did not fundamentally change the strategic situation in the region because we didn't think about what we wanted when the war ended.
Well, gets back to this ecstatic realization. It was like a perfect grand opera because we
Yes.
suffered almost no casualties.
Right.
And then it all went up in smoke within 3 or 4 years.
And we celebrated ourselves and went home.
Yeah.
And the generals were happy to have it over with because they really didn't want to fight to begin with. And they
Right.
were afraid that nothing would work right because these were largely traumatized Vietnam veterans.
That's
And the
true.
various services fought their own wars. And when it's over, there was no effort to deal with the service-centric warfighting doctrines. There was no effort to produce true unity of effort, no effort to create unified military command structures. So everybody says, well, we don't want a unified structure. Well, that's different. People can keep uniforms and funny hats and so forth. I mean, it reminds me of the British Army when they began the process of reducing the numbers of Highland regiments.
Oh, yes. That was
know.
bitter and
Oh
difficult.
my God, people went out of their minds. And here's this tiny place called Scotland trying to fill the ranks.
What to do with the regimental silver?
Yeah, they couldn't do it anymore. They've survived it, okay? It hasn't been a hopeless endeavor. We'll survive what we have to do.
Well, what it does need to be done. If you were in a position, of Godhead and you could impose reforms, if you could at least lay out reforms that had to be pursued and achieved, what would those be?
Well, the first thing you want to do is stop refighting World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about it, but we never do it.
Right.
It means that you've got to treat the 1942 force structure as something to be broken and reassembled in a new form. Then you start at the top and work your way down. You have in a unified command the theater commander, which is effectively what he is. And he has this joint staff.
Right.
But beneath him, he has all these single service headquarters. We can't afford them. They're too expensive. There are too many of them. We need to get rid of them. And we need to restructure those into standing joint force commands. And I would organize these around ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment. We still think of war essentially in a Clausewitzian or Geminian fashion.
Yeah.
And this G1, G2, G3, G4, G5 business, all of that can be folded into a new structure that is ISR, strike,
Yeah.
maneuver, and sustainment.
Right.
Because that's the way the naval forces
That's
and the
true.
air forces are effectively organized. And we are preeminently aerospace and naval power. So really, you're talking about taking what is already experiential
Yeah.
and embedded in the thinking in the aerospace and naval community and pushing it into the ground force. Then you turn around and say, well, what are the new force, the mission force capability packages look like?
Right.
Focused, excuse me. In other words, what are the units of issue that we're going to use? If you go to the Army today, well, we want X, Y, and Z. Here's a division. By the way, it has to have a core slice and a core headquarters. It's jobs for generals.
Yeah, of course.
So if you want us, we have to ship all our generals over there to do this job for you. And we're not going to be subordinate to somebody in the Marines or the Navy or the Air. That's out of the question. You've got to get past all this. So then you set up these joint force headquarters that are designed to take in these modules of combat power, whatever they are, and employ them productively. You may end up supporting someone else who's fighting on the Eurasian landmass, not necessarily your own forces.
Right.
A page out of the British Empire.
Right.
In other words, Wellington's force, out of his entire force, what, a third of them were British? And the rest were Germans,
Belgians.
some Dutch and Belgians, right?
Westphalians.
Yeah, it worked.
It did.
It worked effectively. The British were smart. They weren't going to expend resources they didn't have. And they came out of this thing, on the profit side as opposed to the losing side of the margin.
Yes, that's true.
But the bottom line is we can do these things. We can set up these joint force commands. We can put them under the theater command. We can determine what needs to go into them. And then we can experiment with the right mission-focused capability packages, whatever that is. I suggested on the ground that you have a one-star who commands between 5,000 and 6,000 troops, all organized around ISR strike maneuver sustainment. That's a good place to start.
Yeah.
But the problem is when you talk to the people in the military and you say, you might consider doing this and this and this, they'll say, well, prove to me in advance, before I do that, this will work. Because we know this worked in 1945.
Yeah.
Well, how well did it work in 1969? How well did it work? Well, look at 1991. Well, the truth is we weren't faced with a very capable or determined enemy either. Certainly not on the scale of the Waffen-SS or the Imperial Japanese Army. But no one wants to go there. In other words, the burden of proof, I think it was this person that's over at Brookings, his name escapes me right now, who writes all military affairs all the time, who wrote in 1997, the burden of proof is on McGregor that anything has to change.
Yeah.
We were so successful.
Non-falsifying.
It's a lot of nonsense.
Science. Well, listen, I mean, Americans like to do a little, rosary prayer, and they like to always say, I'm an optimist. And so I'll say, for the first time in my life, I'm an optimist, because I believe, given the kind of dimensionality and direction of what you've just described, that this sort of reform could be done.
Yes.
With someone with a vision and authority to do it, it could be done. Then, however, there is something I'm not optimistic about, and it has been at the, if you will, spiritual knowledge core of our predicament for the last 60 years, and that is the ability to do real net assessment. This is something that I can't find a way out of, not because I can't personally do it, but having been in an institution that talked about the necessity of it and yet never engaged in it and refused to take the steps of cultural receptivity, empathy, all the rest that would allow you to do it, has led me to believe that it simply can't happen within the very ironclad contours of the American ethos, which we know. In American exceptionalism, again, if you're the divine agent of the Almighty, then what you believe about yourself is ground truth.
Well, the last president, and this is an interesting point on presidents in general.
Yeah.
Presidents all come to office with experience in domestic politics.
Right.
Some may have some appreciation or understanding of economics or not. But there are two other categories about which they know almost nothing. One is military affairs or defense.
Right.
And the other is foreign affairs.
Right.
That's the problem. Now, the last man who came in, who knew nothing about domestic politics at all, but did have an understanding of military affairs, foreign affairs, and some understanding of economics, was Eisenhower.
Right. That is true.
And if you go back to the 50s and look what he does, he's constantly scaling back on expenditures, canceling programs, throwing people out of his office who come in with dumb ideas. Even McNamara, who normally everyone enjoys pulverizing,
right,
and with good reason, he had the common sense to tell a group of Army generals, they came into his office, said, well, we need, whatever it was, 32 divisions to deter and defeat the Soviet armed forces. This is before Vietnam.
Yeah.
He said, really? He said, well, how many ships and aircraft do you have to move the equipment and manpower for these 32 divisions? Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately they come back and say, well, we only have the ships and aircraft to move 18 or 20, whatever it was. He said, well, then that's what you're going to get, 20 divisions.
Yeah.
Don't come in here again and push stupid ideas.
That's what the Ford Motor company chair would say.
Yeah, but that's a good thing, and you got to give him credit for that. The problem is we haven't had any of it for decades.
Right.
There's been no accountability. Now there is accountability, and that unfortunately tends to focus largely on who you slept with that you shouldn't have.
Right.
Which is something which would have been completely foreign and alien to John Pershing,
Right.
or George Patton, or any
Right.
number of it. What?
Yeah.
Not that these were immoral men, but there was this disproportionate focus on things that don't count,
Right.
and no focus on the things that do, and a failure to understand that all people are flawed, and we have to accept the fact that human beings are flawed. But what do you want them to do? And this is back to, who are we as a nation? What do we want to do as a nation?
Yeah.
Do we want to be an English-speaking country with a free market that trades with everybody and tries to avoid wars and really doesn't want to fight with anybody, but will defend our interests and will defend our population, our citizens, with all at our disposal? Or do we want to be the global hegemon?
See, the last time that vision was in the ascendant was when Washington delivered the farewell address. Then maybe a few years after the Civil War, but you're making me less optimistic here because Eisenhower was a unique product of a war.
Yes.
And that speaks volumes for him personally. But what I'm missing is how to get the people that we need to lead us get to that level of insight about themselves and America in terms of what needs to be done. And let's look at this from a different angle. The Soviets are constantly slipped. I knew I would eventually. The Russians, throughout their history, have had a military narrative of endless travail, but ultimate victory. And those grave defeats that they've suffered have all served them well, because it took the defeat to create the awakening, to create the necessity. And all of America's defeats after World War II, and I would say since the mid-60s, have not required any reckoning, and have all been written off as overhead, and then actually forgotten. So the big question here, and it's not something that either of us or anyone could answer, is would such a grand shock to the leadership of the U.S., its elites, courtiers, and the military, be enough to break all of the, crenellated castle of prejudice that sits like a rock on the imperial city? Could it happen? Because that could be about what's to happen if certain things unfold the way we've discussed. But would such a blow begin to move the rock?
Well, remember, Clausewitz talked about two kinds of wars: a war of decision,
Yeah.
which involved existential questions for the nation state, and what he called wars of observation, which I normally refer to as low-intensity conflicts or lesser contingencies.
Right.
We've been involved in lesser contingencies, low-intensity conflicts, frankly. Now we're dealing with Ukraine, and what we don't understand is that for Russia, this is an existential conflict. It is now a war of decision. Didn't begin as that because the Russians didn't anticipate it. But now they've got it, and they understand it, and they're going to fight it as a war of decision.
The closest we came to an existential war was, of course, the Civil War.
Yes.
And you could say the first year or so of the American Revolution.
Well, you could also argue, and I'm not saying this is factual, but you could argue that World War II, did raise questions about, the nation and its existence, and it was, quote unquote, a war of decision.
Yes, it was, indeed.
Yeah, so we haven't had a war of decision since 1945.
No, and the kind of afterglow of World War II that I think served as a counterbalance or countervailing force to the super sense of transcendence, gods of war that came out of that experience was the nuclear dimension. And it stayed our hand for decades. But this was arguably, or at least I'll suggest it, the most pernicious consequence of the fall of the Soviet Union, was it took away that countervailing force that was effectively the existential hand staying our course.
Well, obviously, Putin agrees with you, and he's made these statements repeatedly.
We can't get in touch with the existential anymore.
Yeah, but that's true. But the existential questions are not overseas; they're here at home.
Yes, that's right.
And that's where we're headed. But in the meantime, I think we have another problem that you haven't really touched on, and that is where do we draw the talent from that governs us? Well, where are the institutions that produce this sort of special breed of people? Well, historically, we turn to the Ivy Leagues and the service academies. But if we look at the faculties and the teaching in the Ivy Leagues or the service academies right now, that's a frightening prospect.
Well, let's touch on this just briefly then, because you were close to and advised the last president. And in effect, whatever opinions you hold of him, he did represent a mass of Americans who are increasingly being ignored and made marginal in political life. So you ask, where do we get our leaders? We've traditionally got them from elites, but they were elites who were often local elites. Sure, a lot of them came from the Ivy League, went to the State Department, but in terms of running the country, there was still that elite connected to people locally, communities.
You mean Sam Rayburn from Texas?
Yeah, something like that.
Who had cousins in Tennessee, right?
But it was a network, it was a mesh. And now increasingly you have these separate, mostly blue and some red elite communities that essentially own the process from start to finish. They own the universities, they own the media, they own all of the nonprofits that are so important, and they have the money, and they have the two parties and the organization and structure and institutional authority of the two parties. So they're building what amounts to a hermetic, separate political system, something far less sensitive to the people even than a British society in the mid-18th century, which no one would argue was a democracy. But that elite still had capacity for social upward mobility, and it still had it took the pulse of the people. Now increasingly you have a stern and an unforgiving, what Orwell would call the inner party, and the outer party. They are the thing that owns our political system. And so you ask the question, where do we get our leaders? That leads you back to the conundrum that I posed about ever being able to see things, because the entire prime directive of this elite is to preserve and extend its power and control. And it is engaged in doing that. We saw that during the pandemic, and we see it now in the conduct of the war, which is a wholly owned franchise of the Washington elite. And so I worry about this, and you're totally right when you say that the war of decision is at home, because you can't permanently marginalize and reduce to a kind of serfdom the majority of Americans, and I include there all of the blue constituencies who have essentially been marginalized already as well.
Yes.
They form the majority of Americans, and there is no pathway for the voice of this majority to be heard in America today.
Unless the current elites are replaced by a different elite.
Right, and that
emerges from a different milieu.
That's right.
And that's all tied up with what happens next.
That's the revolution.
Yeah, and well, it's also what happens when this narrative for Ukraine collapses.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
This is a great sort of final point for us to make, and you've raised that really nicely, is that the connection between the domestic conflict and the foreign conflict is indissoluble. And just as has happened so many times, the foreign conflict can prise open, turn over the barrel, and let it all spill out. So
I think that's where we're headed.
yeah.